Hey, good morning, everyone. I am Joe Rizzo with the Loudoun Museum, and this is the next interview in our Pour Over History series. And for this week, I am joined by Dr. Adam Domby, who's a professor at the College of Charleston. And he recently had a new book that came out. It is called The False Cause: Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory. So Adam, thanks for joining us here today. Hope things are going well in Charleston.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and to get to talk about my new book, The False Cause, and to get to see you. It's been far too long since we've got to see each other in person, so at least we get to see each other in virtually.
Yeah, 2020 getting together now is just being over Zoom, but hey.
Yeah.
So I want to get right into it. And before we talk about your new book, I know, though, that you've done a lot of research on Loudoun County during the Civil War with some previous research that you've done. So before we get into that book, what are some things that stood out to you about Loudoun County during the Civil War era from that previous research?
Yeah, so my dissertation, which will hopefully be my next book, was about a third of it's on Loudoun County. And I looked at a variety of different communities and sort of went really deep into those communities to figure out what was going on during the war and what was going on after the war. And so there's a couple of things that really stood out to me when I look at Loudoun County. Is first off, the large amount of intra-community conflict. There's a lot of, we think of the Civil War as North versus South. And that's true to a certain extent, but it's also South versus South. And in the case of Loudoun County, you have quite a bit of conflict. You even have the Loudoun Rangers, which is a United States military unit that is raised locally and is primarily Loudoun residents who are fighting for the United States. And they get in conflict with their neighbors. And the really interpersonal level that conflict, it's not just about principles. When you get into that conflict between groups like, Mosby's Raiders and sort of Elijah White's group of guerrillas, when they come into contact with the Loudoun Rangers, it's not about principles, really. It's very personal. And so you have a very personal element of that conflict. And the way that personal conflict continues into Reconstruction has really fascinated me. The way that there's continued fighting, there's continued violence, there's continued conflict in a variety of ways, from court cases to actually like fist fights in the streets of Waterford, is to me a really fascinating aspect that we often ignore. Is that when the war ends with the surrenders at Appomattox, it doesn't end in Loudoun County for those who are living this day to day. And so it really continues far longer. And I don't just mean in the like a month or two longer before they finally surrender at Harper's Ferry and go in and sign their oath of allegiance. I mean, there's, 5 years later, there's fistfights between people who were on different sides of the war. And it's very clear that the war is playing a role in that fistfight. And there's court cases and lawsuits. And there's attempts to try people for the actions that they committed during the war. There's attempts to try people for murder, for deaths that occurred during this guerrilla conflict that occurs especially in northern Loudoun County. And so to me, I think that was probably the most fascinating thing to find, was just sort of how long it lasted and how personal it was for so many people. And it's an aspect that we often ignore when we think about the Civil War.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, after the war, with oaths of allegiance and getting the right to vote back, it's fascinating how the war plays out in different ways, and not just the traditional aspect of 1861 to 1865.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting aspect, actually, is as people are elected, there's efforts to try to get them kicked out of office. A former Confederate guerrilla leader gets elected to be sheriff, and the local sort of unionist, as they call themselves, try to get him removed from office. But he's very clearly using his power to help protect former Confederates. So there's actually a trial where a former Confederate's being tried for murder as a guerrilla, and Elijah White, the new sheriff, who was a former Confederate guerrilla himself, he chooses the jury, which, not surprisingly, acquits the guy. And so you have all these sort of efforts to sort of try to get revenge or get justice, depending on how you look at it, right? One man's justice is another man's revenge. And sort of the way that this plays out is very political. And so you see it in the politics of the time, and how much the sort of politics of Reconstruction, we often recognize the way that race plays a role, and it does. I mean, race is central to to sort of the politics of Reconstruction, there's also this wartime loyalty element that's often overlooked.
Yeah, great point. So it's, some of these issues will come up when we talk about your book, but your book idea originated when you were in Chapel Hill, and I think it revolved around the Silent Sam Monument. Why was that monument erected? And really, how has that perception then, since it was erected, changed over the years about that monument?
So this is sort of what drew me to this topic. I didn't really mean to write this book. I always say I sort of fell into it. I was a grad student and I found a dedication speech, the dedication speech given by Julian Carr, who was a Confederate veteran, in which he talks about what he thought this new Confederate monument put up in 1913. So about the same time, very similarly timed to the Confederate monument that went up in Leesburg. They're sort of contemporaneous monuments. They're within 5 years of each other, 6 years of each other that they went up. And this monument is sort of a typical, in some ways, Confederate monument. It's a little different in how it was fundraised for, and it has a younger man on it because it's supposed to represent the students who went off to war. But otherwise, it's pretty similar to a lot of Confederate monuments, especially in how the dedication went. And at the dedication, Julian Carr told the audience what he felt this monument represented and what it celebrated. And he was very explicit that this monument celebrated white supremacy. He said as much. And what's fascinating is, and he then went on to say, it's about the overthrow of Reconstruction and the disenfranchisement of African Americans. And he sort of says, this is what this monument's about. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but then he says, and let me tell you what I did to help with this process of sort of taking power away from African Americans. And he says, I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirt hung in tatters. So he's bragging about assaulting someone in a race-based crime. And that's something that you don't normally see someone brag about, let's say. But he was very explicit about it. And the speech was so unremarkable, and it's so similar to so many other speeches he gave, with the exception of his own personal experience being included, that it didn't even make it in the newspaper. It just mentions that he gave a speech. In time, this speech was largely forgotten. But I sort of stumbled onto it in the archives, and it has since, become public, in part because I published, but mostly because activists took my research and really used it to educate the local community and said, look, this monument, when it was put up, they said this is about white supremacy. And it's very hard to argue with that. You can argue about, is this a monument to the cause of the Confederacy, or is it just to the soldiers? But when you look at the actual dedication speech and the guy says this is a monument to the success of white supremacy, it's hard to argue it doesn't have ties to white supremacy, because it does. It's right there. He's given that tie when it's dedicated. And some people are like, well, he's not representative, except that he's probably the most prolific Confederate veteran when it comes to speaking at monument dedications. And they invited him because of his views, not despite them. And he was the leading Confederate veteran for all of North Carolina. He literally is the head of the United Confederate Veterans national body by the 1920s. So this guy is elected because of his views, not despite them. And so that speech ultimately led to really a shift in the debate about the appropriateness of the Confederate monument, from being one about, is this a monument to slavery, to is this a monument about white supremacy during the Jim Crow era? And it really led to a shift in opinion. If you looked in 2008, very few professors at the University of North Carolina were discussing whether or not a monument should be removed. They were talking about whether or not they weren't even talking about it, really. By 2017, you had over 10 departments have passed resolutions calling for its removal, including the history department, the art history department, and numerous others. And so there's a real shift in public opinion, in large part driven by activists utilizing historical research. And so that's one of the reasons I ended up writing this book, was that I realized that this was a book that mattered right now. Understanding how people remember the Civil War is something that is contested today.
Yeah, and monuments are very public reminders of that. So with the Silent Sam one, I know sometimes there's ideas and people try to do kind of different counter monuments or counter narratives or contextualizing monuments. Did they do that with Silent Sam at all?
So yeah, this is a really interesting one. There's been a couple efforts actually to sort of create a counter monument or counter memory. And the first example of this was not explicitly a counter memory, and its original design actually called for it to be placed outside the line of sight. But due to trees growing in the wrong place, and basically they were worried about damaging the roots, they had to change where they placed it in the end. And so what was known as the Unsung Founders Monument, which was a monument to the free people of color and the enslaved people of color who founded the college, the University of North Carolina, who sort of helped build it up, was placed within the line of sight of the University of North Carolina's monument, Silent Sam. And it was a spectacular failure. It was a table, essentially, that had small, sort of faceless almost figures holding up a monument, holding up this table. And you could sit at the table, and when you sat at the table, your feet kicked the figures that were holding it up. So there's some real, like, sort of architectural problems to start with. It's also much smaller than the Confederate monument. And it also isn't clear it's a memorial, this memorial to the unsung founders. And so people used it to, like, eat lunch and change their baby's diaper on it. And so it sort of just almost in some ways made Silent Sam worse, because in the eyes of many students of color, because it was like, you gave us this failure of a table where the enslaved people are still holding up the monument. That's like what they're having to do. They're still holding it up, and you kick them when you sit there, and people don't respect it. And then you have this Confederate monument in contrast. And so the problem in the end, when you're trying to do these sort of counter monuments where you put them next to each other, and you're sort of trying to sort of come to a compromise, right, where you sort of will have both narratives in conversation with each other, is that often one narrative is fundamentally contradicted by the other, right? One of the sort of central tenets of the Lost Cause, as it was originally formulated, sort of this original narrative of how we're going to remember the war, we're going to pretend slavery is not part of it, even though it was. And let's be clear, slavery is the cause of the Civil War. It's central. You don't have a Civil War without it. But one of the central other sort of tenets that you see pushed again and again is that slavery wasn't so bad, or that slaves were happy. And let's be clear, slavery was a horrible exploitive system premised on terror and violence and murder to gain labor and compliance. It's horrifying. There's no defense of it in our modern era. But that being said, the memory of it that was pushed forward that helps sort of defend the Confederacy's legacy required you to remember slavery as a positive good. And so when you put next to it a monument that's basically saying slavery is bad, you get a cognitive dissonance. And they fundamentally sort of, everyone is left unhappy. Those who want to see the Confederate monument remain feel like their Confederate monument is being demeaned by having this sort of condemning monument next to it. And those who want to sort of memorialize slavery and the horrors of slavery find it to be very tokenistic when you have a monument literally to the people who enslaved them next to it, right? It doesn't sort of work for either group. And so the idea that you can sort of put a monument next to each other that are somehow equal. Now there is talk about maybe you could do a monument that makes the other one less equal, right? That sort of displays the Confederate monument as inferior, but then you'd still have this issue that it's not really a compromise in that situation. One of my students once suggested having a larger monument next to it, stepping on the smaller, older monument, and that would change its meaning. And sure, that would change its meaning, but that's not a compromise anymore. Then you're just creating a new message, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hard to sort of find a compromise with these battles, because what you're fundamentally discussing is how we remember the past, and how we remember the past is all about the present. It's all about how we got where we are today and who's empowered today. And whenever you're looking at a monument, you're not looking at what it nominally commemorates. You're looking at the time period that it's put up and what it's being used for. And so when you look at Confederate monuments, the vast majority of them are put up sort of 1890 to 1925, right in the rise, and right when really once Jim Crow is firmly established, you see these monuments go up everywhere. And they very clearly, as they're put up, and they say this again and again at the dedications, they are celebrating the overturn of some aspects of the war, including African Americans being politically empowered.
And I wonder too, so many counties, again, from your previous research, so many counties were divided over secession and the war. For the county where UNC is and Silent Sam is, was it a divided county about how they felt about secession? Because sometimes I wonder if maybe they're even also put up to maybe gloss over the fact that there was a lot of division at the time for support of the war.
Yeah, and this is something the book looks at actually in like the third chapter. It looks quite a bit at this issue of division and how it's erased. And one of the aspects of Confederate memory is remembering all white Southerners as supporting the Confederacy. And the truth of the matter is all white Southerners did not support the Confederacy. give you some stats that are fun. 100,000 approximately white Southerners fought for the United States. Now, to give you that sort of a scale of what that is, that's larger than the Army of Northern Virginia at its largest. And so that's a massive shift in manpower. When you add the 200,000 African Americans who fight for the United States, you're looking at you're nearing in on 300,000 Southerners, because I'm including black and white Southerners as Southerners, who are fighting for the United States military. That's a massive amount. It's somewhere in the order of, it's over 10%, it's nearing on probably in the order of 13, 14, 15% of the United States military is from the South. And that's a big number when you think about it, and a big movement of manpower. And so one way you erase that is you make it so everyone was a volunteer. And you really actually see this with Silent Sam, is that they say at the dedication, everyone was volunteering, everyone loved to volunteer. And the guys who are literally saying this, the guys who are on stage that are Confederate veterans, were conscripts. So you have these guys on stage who are like, we all went to war because we loved the Confederacy, we wanted to go to war. And you look at their letters from the actual wartime, and they're writing their sisters saying, I know it's my duty to go to war, but I got an exemption, and you can't really expect me to go to war when I got an exemption. And so they managed to wait until really 64, 65, these guys who are students, some of them, they stay in college for the first 3 years of the war, and they only go in the last few months in some cases. And there's actually questions in 1900 when Julian Carter runs for office, questions are raised over whether he even saw combat. And we don't actually know for sure. We don't have a firm answer, but there are accusations made in 1900 by his political opponents when he's running for office that he never actually saw combat. And I suspect he did see some combat, but it was definitely limited in when it comes to time period, at least. It was in the final 3 months of the war, 4 months of the war.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point too, because both northern and southern states both have the issue of trying to raise enough troops, and then both sides are looking for various ways for conscription. A fascinating aspect that both armies are contending with, but it's interesting how no one brags about being conscripted, maybe if they fought, and how sometimes, especially at reunions after the fact too, how, I think it was like the one, 50 years later at Pickett's Charge reunion where there were more soldiers saying they were a part of that one than there actually were at the time.
Yeah, this is a classic problem. In fact, there's a Loudoun connection to this sort of pretending you're a veteran issue that's worth pointing out. One of sort of Loudoun's most famous soldiers, he wasn't from there, but he fought there in Loudoun, and is John Singleton Mosby, right? And Mosby, famously after the war, he did not abide by the lost cause. He was annoyed when people would claim the war wasn't about slavery. He'd say, no, the war was about slavery. I fought in this war. I know what the war was about. I've read South Carolina's Articles of Secession. So here you have a Confederate veteran who is openly saying in like 1901 and 1907, this was a war about slavery. Now, one of the reasons he's willing to do that is that the lost cause is so heavily tied to conservative democratic politics in that period. And this is, of course, before party realignment in the 20th century. And so he joins the more liberal and the radical Republican Party. And so he's one of these few Confederates who joins the Republican Party after the war. And so he's not invested in the narrative in the same way because of the political ties to it. And I talk a lot about this in the book. I won't go too deep into it. But one of the things that Mosby does, and you guys are straight in the Mosby's Confederacy, right? You're in the dead center of Mosby's Confederacy. Mosby won't go to reunions. He stops going to reunions because he says that more guys are showing up to these reunions than actually served with him. And he says, if I had as many men as claimed they were with me during the war, I would have run Grant out of Virginia. And so he sees a lot of fake veterans. And actually, one of the things the book looks at is this proliferation of fake veterans. And one of the things we know looking at reunions, the last Confederate Veterans Reunion had no veterans at it. It was literally a bunch of guys sitting around a table, all hoping no one outed them for being a fake. Most of them had actually been born either during or after the war. And so you have this issue of pension fraud and people pretending that they served that allows them to be remembered in a certain way. And so these guys who deserted or didn't want to fight end up getting remembered as Confederate volunteers despite that. And it's really made it into our historiography to this day. And so there's still this expectation that Confederate soldiers were the world's greatest soldiers and that they all volunteered. And the reality is we're not sure how well they fought. We know that the reason that we remember them as fighting really well is because of lies. And so we actually need a reassessment, was one of the things the book argues, of the Confederate soldier and how devoted they were. Because we've been asking this question for so long of why did the Confederacy last so long? And the book is asking, one of the questions the book asks is, wait a minute, maybe we should be asking, why didn't they last longer? I mean, they lasted a remarkably short time when you think about equivalent sort of other conflicts in American history. Sort of, the fight against ISIS or the American Revolution last much longer. And the United States military in 1860 is 16,000 men. And they have to grow massively. I mean, literally, just on magnitudes of scale, they have to grow their army. It takes a while to do that. And so 4 years is remarkably short, you could argue, for when you compare it to, say, Washington. Now, obviously, there's difference between George Washington's time and today's time, but there's clearly some room for interpretation over whether we're asking the right questions.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point to bring up. And I think a large role to play in that is with civilians and what civilians are expecting out of war and expecting out of armies too. So not even just the soldiers, but really how people are viewing, a country and what they expect out of their military. Yeah,
and this is sort of crucial because it's a lot of this has to do with the question of, like, should Lee have tried a different strategy? Did Lee have a strategy? And there's some debates about this question about whether or not Lee could have used a strategy like Washington's, where he sort of doesn't try to hold terrain as much and moves around more and allows the capital to fall earlier, perhaps to preserve his army, just like Washington did, right? Washington allows Philadelphia to fall, he allows New York to fall, and he keeps fighting in a way, and he doesn't try to hold them in this last-ditch attempt like Lee does. The difference is, of course, it comes down to what they're fighting about, though, is that Lee fundamentally wants to preserve slavery. That's what he's fighting for. And a guerrilla war where he keeps giving up territory and allows the United States military to basically take the entire country except where his army is, destroys slavery after 1862, right? Or by 1863. Once you have the Emancipation Proclamation and the United States Army arriving at a place means the end of slavery there, Lee can't go hide in the mountains and wage a decade-long war to win, because by the time he would have won that war, even if he won, slavery would have been decimated by the United States military coming in. And so his strategy in some ways dictated by the cause of the war. And so the role of slavery, we often think about the role of slavery as people like to sort of say, like, oh, it's about slavery, but that doesn't influence the way the war's fought. And it turns out that actually does influence the way the war's fought, not just in Lee's strategy, but also in why that leads to, say, racial massacres, why it is that the Confederacy is unable to mobilize a large portion of its population who are enslaved because they're not willing to arm them, right? Of course, this is the myth of Black Confederates. They're not true. We don't have thousands of Black Confederates, just to push that out there. I talk about that in the 4th chapter and 5th chapter, but the sort of war is fought in part because of slavery, the way it plays out as well as why it played out.
Yeah, and that you can't always separate the home front and the war front, that they both are coexisting in very similar ways and they impact each other.
They're fundamentally tied together. You really cannot understand one without the other. And, guerrilla warfare, there's a big debate in the field of how important is Confederate warfare in the outcome of the war. And I don't know how important it was in the outcome of the war, but it certainly shaped the way people remembered the war, and it certainly shaped the way the country put itself back together, specifically the South put itself back together afterwards, and the conflicts during Reconstruction. It shaped a lot more in some ways than, say, the Battle of Gettysburg shaped home front sort of conflict after the war. And so when you're looking at sort of the way it shapes the South, guerrilla warfare is fundamentally important. And Loudoun's dead center in that story.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much, what defines Loudoun was the irregular style warfare that was a day-to-day part of people's lives.
Right, and the other thing that's interesting about Loudoun, of course, is that Loudoun trades hands so many times that there are a decent number of Loudoun residents who never really get conscripted. Instead, they flee to Maryland when they need to, and they never join really either army. There's a large number of people who are trying to sort of be neutral. You also have the Quaker population that's trying to be neutral as well, although some of them clearly have Unionist leanings as well, and some clearly have Confederate leanings. And there's really clearly the war breaks up friendships. I mean, you really see this in the sort of Waterford area. And there's the great book by John Suters, and I'm forgetting the second author's name off the top of my head. Yeah, Chamberlain, on about neither Reb nor Yank.
I think it's Between Reb and Yank. Yeah.
Between Reb and Yank. It's a great book that really details everything about Loudoun County's conflict and the way that sort of people are trying to navigate, and the way it breaks up communities. And it was a great book written by a local Loudoun resident that I really enjoyed reading. It is very detailed and has sort of for any historians out there who are trying to figure out what happened in Loudoun, it is the place to start.
Absolutely. So Adam, thanks so much for joining us again. Your book is called The False Cause, Fraud, Fabrication, and White Supremacy in Confederate Memory. When the museum is back up in terms of letting people in it, at least, we'll definitely bring you up for a book talk.
I'd love to come visit. Yeah. And if people want to order it, you can order it from the UVA Press. It's from the University of Virginia Press website, and there's currently a sale going on. And they can, there's a little code that pops up when you look at the book on the University of Virginia Press's website and get a discount. And so I encourage people to order a book, obviously, not that I'm biased.
Awesome. Again, well, thanks, Adam, for joining us. Stay safe.
Thank you.
I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, take care.